Well, hey everyone, and welcome to Common Good Conversations, a podcast working to re-examine and reimagine narratives at the intersection of faith, politics, and social issues by striving towards the principle of the common good. My name is Nick Brock, and today we have with us the Mr. Shawn.
How we doing?
Shawn Skinner. And we have the privilege of being in conversation with a subject matter expert from an organization that represents the only unelected vice president and unelected president of the United States, who also hails from Grand Rapids, Michigan. Shawn Skinner, do you know who that president might be?
You had to get me on a sip of my coffee right there, didn't you? The Gerald R. Ford.
That's right. Good thing we did just our prep 30 seconds beforehand. The Mr. Gerald R. Ford. So Jeff Polet is the director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation in downtown Grand Rapids. Jeff, I'm just going to give a little bio here. So you are a native of West Michigan, and you were previously the professor of political science at Hope College for 18 years. And you also received your BA of philosophy from Calvin and your MA and PhD of philosophy from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. So, Jeff, welcome to the conversation. Here is my first question. When it comes to the Hope Calvin basketball rivalry, where do you stand? Are you a Flying Dutchman or are you a Knight?
I am a Flying Dutchman.
Okay.
Yeah, I grew up in Holland, and so I was always interested in Hope. Growing up, went to their games when I was a kid, and it has nothing to do with the mercenary reason that they paid me for 18 years. Nothing. Yeah,
no biased.
No. I have great affection for Hope. It was very hard for me to leave there. I've had so many great students over the years.
Wow. Yeah.
Orange and blue.
Orange and blue all the way, huh?
Yep.
Born and raised in Holland. Yeah, that's do you have a game, like a specific game or rivalry that you remember between the basketball teams, or is that not so much a thing for you?
Oh, no. Basketball is a big thing for me. I suppose one that stands out in my mind. Hope has been on the losing end of a lot of buzzer beaters against Calvin.
Mm-hmm.
And one that stands in my mind is at the old No Crust Fieldhouse. One of the last games, I think, at the old No Crust Fieldhouse. And Calvin had a point guard named Caleb Veldhouse, and he nailed about a 40-footer at the buzzer to beat us. And that was a particularly painful memory. I grew up in Michigan. I indulge painful memories. I don't have memories of glory.
Well,
sounds
speaking
like
of
Lions fan too.
Exactly.
Yeah. The painful memories. Shawn's drinking the Kool-Aid. Pretty good right now too.
Bathing in that Kool-Aid.
But they have something to it this year. So good luck to them.
Yep.
So Jeff, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation's mission statement is to foster increased awareness of the life, career, values, and legacy of America's 38th president. And it does so through activities designed to promote the high ideals of integrity, honesty, and candor that define President Ford's extraordinary career of public service. I'm pulling that snippet just from the website. So my question here is, Jeff, with the foundation's goal to promote integrity, honesty, and candor, have you discovered over the past few years, especially through the Trump administration and now the Biden administration, that people genuinely want to see these high ideals in the public space? Or is this just something, that people say and then they just part their ways through their partisan politics?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So there's two parts to that. There's what people think they're doing, and then there's what they are actually doing. So I think if you would ask most people, are you being honest? Are you operating here with great integrity? They'd tell you yes. Whether they are in fact doing that is another question. And one of the reasons why that's a problem is precisely what you just indicated, and that's right. We have blinders on. In psychology, they refer to this as cognitive biases, and we operate with all kinds of cognitive biases, and they skew our perception of things. When I taught political science, by the way, one of the questions I would get frequently from students was, how do you vote? You're Republican or a Democrat. And I would always tell them, you can't be a competent political scientist if you're a Republican or a Democrat, because your political blinders, your party blinders are obscuring your ability to see the world as objectively as you possibly can. So I think on the one hand, everybody's going to believe that they're objective and fair-minded and honest. And it's the people who are on the other side who are the problem.
Yeah, Jeff,
And
can you go back and say what you did there? You can't be how are you, because you're a Republican or a Democrat, you can't be
objective,
politically objective.
politically
Okay.
objective. Yeah, because you're always going to be processing information with a particular end in mind.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than allowing the information to kind of dictate your conclusions, you're allowing your conclusions to dictate the information.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just a fundamental cognitive bias we operate with as human beings. And so one of the things we have to do is figure out how we kind of cleanse ourselves of those sorts of things. So, just again as an aside, over the years, I have a kind of collection of things I've been accused of being, when I go public speaking or something like that. And I've been accused of being everything.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Could you be a little more specific there? Because I have a few things in mind. I mean, being linked to the presidential museum, the Ford Museum, and clearly President Ford was a Republican during the 70s, just a long time Republican. And the words that people bring to me when they talk about President Ford was, a conservative Republican. Kind of a very candid person and friendly person. Some folks, Republicans within West Michigan, refer to themselves as a Jerry Ford Republican.
Mm-hmm.
So with that in mind, what are people saying to you in this negative way?
Well, I mean, I've had people call me a socialist, a communist, a Marxist, a fascist.
What are they basing that? What are they basing that on? Just because?
It's something I've written or something I've said. A lot of times it's at public lectures or so. And then there is a particular thing that just sets off the neurons, right? And so they're not listening closely and carefully to the whole of what I'm saying. They're just kind of looking for markers. And as soon as I hit one of those markers, they label it. They put it in the box and they go, okay, I got this guy figured out. And I think that's really one of the problems that we're having in our politics is this labeling problem, right? And that is putting each other in boxes. And we find a really small nugget of information that is a marker for us. And it allows us to ideologically label someone. And then we put someone in that box. And then we have a whole complex of associated pathologies.
Like clickbait.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. So anybody who's in that box must be this kind of person.
Yeah, 10% of a conversation dictates the entire conversation.
That's right.
So we have these it's difficult to be politically objective if we are just really dedicated to our political affiliation, whether we're a Republican or a Democrat. There's just these blinders and biases. How do you instruct or guide people to move through that? We hear this a lot now that, and I don't know how much more so this is different from when, Ford was in the presidency, coming out of the Nixon and Watergate, this political divisiveness. How do you steer people out of that? Given that the rancor within the parties right now seems to be so deep.
It's an extremely difficult task. It's hard to do on a one-to-one basis. It's very difficult to do on some kind of mass basis. So on a one-to-one basis, I would just engage people in conversation and say, so why does this issue mean so much to you? Right? If you're so passionate about this, why? Why does it mean so much to you? With my students, when this would come up in class and they'd be, really worked up about something, I'd say, all right, what I want you to do is to falsify your position. All right, we're going to find positions that matter a lot to you. and on which you have strong opinions, and then you're going to write me an essay arguing against your opinion. And it's a variation of what Alexander Hamilton talks about in Federalist Paper number 1, where he's talking about the people who are opposing the Constitution. And he says something pretty interesting that I've always thought is really interesting. He says, our natural assumption is going to be to assume that they have bad arguments and bad motives, and to assume that we have good arguments and good motives. But in order for this democracy to work, we have to assume that they probably have good motives. I mean, most people don't go into this thinking that they're doing bad. They don't think they're bad people. They don't think they're doing bad things. And they probably have reasons for the positions that they hold. And then Hamilton says, you know what? And it's possible that our motives are not as pure as we think, and that our ability to reason is not as good as we think. And so, the way I've always summarized that is, for democracy to work, you have to have charity toward your opponent and humility and skepticism toward yourself. But if you live in a world where we're skeptical about our opponents and charitable toward ourselves, democracies can't work. They require that kind of humility, that kind of skepticism about oneself. The problem is it doesn't scale real well. Yeah. And the reason why it doesn't scale well is because in a mass society, people begin to feel very helpless, powerless, and inconsequential. And the result is they will join these large movements as a way of augmenting their own self-concept, as a way of augmenting their way of approaching politics. If I can't get anything done on my own, then I'll join the group. And perhaps in this kind of group way, we can get things done. But of course, the price of admission into the group is agreement. And so now you've got a kind of cycle going on where you want to become part of that as a way of feeling consequential, feeling significant, and then being part of that group in turn, kind of rubs against your own personality, and you become more identified with it.
Yeah. Do you have, in terms of these groups, do you see, or what example would you cite for that? Like this particular group, like where people are heading towards this way, they want to scale things up, but they don't know how. Do you define specific political organizations or groups doing that?
Yeah, if you want to look at specific groups, I mean, I think there's a kind of general cultural thing going on there, but you asked about specific groups. Political parties do this to some degree, but it's more what we call affinity groups that tend to do this. So if you look on the political right now, you'll see something like this happening in this this masculinity movement. I can't remember the guy's name. Who's the guy who was kind of involved in all that? Listeners will know, but
a politician or an author?
No. He's a cultural figure.
Okay,
Schwarzenegger.
I'm sorry,
Schwarzenegger.
No, right. So what
recent.
happens? You rightly or wrongly, you have a group of men who feel themselves as being powerless, and when politics becomes about nothing more than power, and that's kind of the underlying pathology of our day, is that we understand politics to be about nothing more than power. And they experience themselves as powerless. What are they going to do? They're going to try to seize power and exert power for themselves. And so on the right, you've got groups that are kind of doing this. You can see this in sort of racially motivated groups. So this kind of return of a sort of white nationalism or something like that. On the left, you see it in groups such as Antifa or Black Lives Matter. And that is where people will join the organization as a way of exerting power in the political sphere, and will suspend their critical faculties in order to sustain their belonging to that group.
So they're in a way, you're kind of saying some people kind of, I don't know, change their morals a little bit just to be part of a bigger unity and everything to get what they think might be the common good for themselves, opposed to working with others and everything, just conglomerating into one thing.
Yeah, yeah. And what they won't do is, I mean, in a certain sense, we're all a little morally flexible, right? I mean, we learn some things, and we learn things about ourselves that are morally objectionable. We learn things that are morally right. I mean, none of these groups get traction unless they're putting their finger on some kind of moral pulse.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's what we're responding to in a certain sense. And I mean, part of it is our desire to feel like we're good people. I mean, everybody wants to believe they're a good person. And so part of what this does, what these groups do, they really do two important things. One, they give us a sense of belonging. And again, in a kind of mass democratic culture where you have a lot of fragmentation taking place, you don't have kind of natural belonging that's happening. A simple example of this is what happens to families. Right, you send your kids off to college. I got one kid who lives in Phoenix. I got another kid who lives in Chicago.
Mm-hmm.
Right, so there's this kind of fracturing of families that takes place, and people become more isolated from one another. And so, right, on the one hand, we have all these social factors leading toward isolation. So what happens when people feel isolated? Right, that human need to belong to something doesn't go away, and so
Yeah.
they'll find something else to belong to, but they'll do it on terms that are kind of morally acceptable to them.
Yeah. They'll find
Yeah.
something in the area that kind of relates to them from where they originally were a bit, and try to fit in where they want to fit in.
That's right. And so this is that's a great way to put it, right? What do people want to know? Will I fit in? Will I belong? Do I belong there? And belonging creates meaning for people. And whatever else is true of us as human beings, we're meaning hungry creatures.
Yeah, so I want to take that piece right there. This people wanting a sense of belonging, and coming out of this place of wanting to do better. Um, so the Ford Leadership Forum, which you direct, is inspired by President Ford's virtue-anchored leadership to help the rising generations grow their potential for excellence in a world that desperately needs the Ford brand to find common good for the to find common ground for the greater good. Again, that is from the website. So I wonder, first, could you expound on this virtue anchored leadership under the Ford brand that you're trying to, well, that you do promote and that you want to extend to those who are interested? What does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. You're like, oh, that sounds really nice. What does it actually mean, and how do you operationalize it? It means this. In another one of the Federalist Papers, Federalist Paper number 55, James Madison is reflecting on this Republican system of government that they're creating. And on the one hand, he says, we know that one of the perennial problems of political life is people pursuing self-interest instead of the common good. Right? They'll always pursue what's good for themselves instead of the common good. And he said, that's baked into the nature of things. That's just the way we are. The seeds of dissension are sown into the nature of man, he says. So on the one hand, he says, how do you create a political system that just assumes that people are always going to be pursuing their self-interest and still make it a well-ordered and ultimately just political system? And he says, so this is the kind of plan that we've come up with. This is how we think we can do this. But then later on, he says, he's talking about the system of government, and he goes, yeah, there's criticism that this is going to make people more self-interested, more inclined toward vice. And, can you have a system like this without virtue? And he says, absolutely not. This system of government presupposes virtue to a higher degree than any other. We can't make this work unless we have virtuous citizens and virtuous leaders.
Mm-hmm.
So he's quite clear about that. And then from that point forward, this is kind of what they're constantly saying. We have to have virtuous citizens. Right? You can't create a system of government so perfect that that doesn't matter what kind of citizens you have.
Yeah. So Jeff, I want to pull you back a little bit there. So for our listeners, or for maybe us who may not be so tuned up on the Federalist Papers, can you just give like a brief snippet of the Federalist Papers? Because in a lot of these conversations about politics that I have, they're about, oh, we need to get back to the Constitution, or we need to, people talk about the Declaration of Independence. The Federalist Papers are not talking about so much, but historically very important. Can you just give us an overview here of what you're referencing?
Yep, this is after the Constitution was written, and it was sent to the states for ratification. And in the states, they had ratifying conventions, and there were all kinds of arguments about whether to adopt the Constitution or not. That was very narrowly adopted. There was a lot of resistance to it. And so the people who were opposing the new Constitution wrote all kinds of essays. And then people who were supporting the Constitution began to write essays in defense of the Constitution. And the main documents that were written in the defense of the Constitution are known as the Federalist Papers. Madison, Hamilton, and John Jay are the three authors of those. And it's a defense of the constitutional system against the people who were saying we should never adopt this thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So to go back to this idea, and one of the things that the opponents were saying is you can't have good government without virtuous leaders and virtuous citizens. And the Constitution is based upon self-interest. It's not based upon any kind of working notion of the common good. And one of the reasons why they thought that is because you can't have an idea of the common good if you have too great a territory and too many people involved. Right, that the more you expand the sphere of government, the more unlikely it will be that you can find a common good.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's why it doesn't scale well.
Mm-hmm.
And so Madison says, no. But he said, we still require virtue. And by that, he means what we referred to at the Ford as the moral, the intellectual, and the civic virtues. And these go back to the ancient world. And, the intellectual virtues would be things such as humility, fair-mindedness, logic, kind of reasoning processes.
That doesn't sound like politics.
No, no. Not currently, no.
No. Yeah. So humility, logic, fair-mindedness, and you're going to say a few others, but to Shawn's point there, these are not points that are stressed by politicians or in political campaigns. You don't hear politicians running on these things. Could you continue with that list and expound on that piece a bit?
Sure. No, it's absolutely true that these do not mark our current politics. And if you look at the presidential debates, I've always said if I ever had a candidate, not even a candidate, if I was ever watching a presidential debate and one of the candidates said, I never thought about things that way before. My opponent here is making a really persuasive argument, and he's corrected some of my errors. I'd vote for that person.
I was going to say, I'd almost just swing that way just because of that, just to hear the humility and everything. It's become such a spectacle now. I don't think the debates really do much more than have, hey, everybody, let's watch these idiots on the stage just step over each other for an hour.
Yeah, that's exactly. And stepping over each other is an important point of that, right? Because one of the moral virtues that we're talking about are things such as patience, consideration, toleration, and so forth. So hey, let me finish. I remember one of the controversial things in the 2016 debates was just Trump constantly interrupting and violating the rules. And you say, okay, so rule following is a virtue, right?
Mm-hmm.
I agreed to this in advance. Same thing with elections. Rule following. I agreed in advance to this set of rules. You can't change the rules after the event is over.
Is there a rule on that in the debates that I don't know about? If you interrupt him 3 times, sorry, your mic's off. You're done. You're out.
There should be. Well, because and you put your finger on what's a problem, and that is, what if there's no one to enforce the rules, or an unwillingness to enforce the rules?
Well, it just always seems like the moderators just let him finish. Excuse me, and it does always seem like they always end up picking maybe 1 or 2 candidates that get the most questions, and you got 5 people up there, and 2 out of the 5 just stand there. They maybe get a question, and then the rest just keep fighting among themselves, and then you almost sit there and look, okay, those 2 are going to be out because they aren't even having them be involved.
Mm-hmm.
And to connect that to something Nick said earlier, the rules emerge out of our interactions with each other. Right? We learn what works. We learn what doesn't work. They don't descend from on high. The rules are slowly, patiently built over time by human beings trying to figure out how to live with one another peacefully. And that's why they have a certain status to them, a certain authority to them. I think one of the problems that we're facing is this kind of collapse of authority. And so to tie those 2 things together, you can think about the way this is working in Congress right now. They don't know how to operate by the rules, and they don't know. They can't even settle on who is going to be in positions of authority to enforce the rules. Because as soon as you have someone in a position of authority, what happens? The people who oppose that person immediately turn against them. In the House of Representatives, it's been chaos. And it's been chaos because we don't have people who are being properly formed in accordance with the norms of those institutions. Because that's what institutions do, right? They create norms by which they're going to operate, and then they help form the people who are going to operate in those institutions. But what if the people who are in those institutions are being formed by something else other than by the institutional ethos itself? And I think the House of Representatives is a great example of this.
Yeah, and for our listener who may not be up to speed with this, Jeff is referencing the Republican leadership in the House of Representatives voting to get rid of the House Speaker Kevin McCarthy. So now then the House is in disarray, and they need to find a new House Speaker. So that is what Jeff is speaking
and leadership
about.
Is a really kind word to apply to them, by the way.
Hey, you said it. I didn't, but I think that's. Very much so. It's very much this lack of leadership and chaos. It's very much on display.
What are they? They're voting him out based on what?
They don't like the way he handled the budget issue. They were trying to extract a number of concessions with regard to the budget. They were perfectly willing to shut down the government to prevent some things from happening and to get other things in the budget bill. And McCarthy thought it was more important to get to keep the government open, to get a budget passed, than to be a purist about every little element of the budget.
So he just wasn't swinging his side of the gate according to the party, and they said, nope, we don't.
Yeah, and I think that this is indicative. If we talk about civic virtues, the primary virtue of a political leader is prudence, and the mechanism that the political leader will use to exercise prudence will be things such as compromise, cooperation, negotiation. Realizing you can't always have your way.
Do those exist in politics nowadays?
It's one of the things we try to teach our kids, right? You can't always get your way. And
Well, I'm a father of 2 and 5-year-old girls. That's a battle every single day. I was trying to figure out how to get them to compromise.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah. Well,
every day.
They might be able to teach something to our Congress, because one of the things that's happened in our politics is people have become purists.
Mm-hmm.
And they expect an awful lot from our politics, and they are unwilling to compromise. There's no half loaves; it's only full loaves. So they're purists, and that any kind of compromise is a moral compromise, right? So when politics and morality become too intermixed with each other in the wrong ways, right? And you start viewing political compromise as moral compromise, I think that's where you run into some trouble.
But don't they kind of go hand in hand? You can't really be all moral one side or all, you kind of have to find a middle ground to find something that you feel like you're part of, right? You can't just always all one way or the other.
Right. Well, and also it depends on, like I said, what you expect out of politics.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you think that politics are a mechanism to bringing in a kind of perfect society or something like that, you're really raising the stakes. So an example I might use would be something along the lines of, let's say you've got, Shawn and Nick, you guys both want to go on vacation. You both have a week off. You want to go on vacation. And Nick wants to go to Boston and Shawn wants to go to Florida. Okay, what are your options here? Well, one option is that Nick could grab Shawn, throw him in the trunk of his car, and drive him to Boston against his will.
Oh,
and so
that's
how we're doing our politics. And I think that's often how we're doing our politics. Right? So what's going to happen? Well, when Nick opens that trunk and Shawn is let out, right? Shawn's going to be angry, right? And he's going to lash out. And so when you have politics where people are constantly forcing people to do something against their will, you can be assured there's going to be some sort of backlash, and probably some kind of violent backlash against that. I think that's kind of a stage that we're in right now.
You can't force someone to love you.
That's correct. Yeah. And so what you might say is, I tell you what, let's go to North Carolina. Let's split the difference. Let's go to North Carolina, or let's go to Virginia or something like that, Washington, D.C. So one thing you might try to do is compromise. So what's important to us? What's important to us here is that we spend a week together on vacation. Where is less important than who? But what if where means more to you than who does? And, then you might say, I tell you what, why don't we just not go on vacation? Let's just stay here and hang out here. And that's a kind of compromise, right? Where you both say, maybe the best solution is for neither one of us to get our way. And where we can't agree on something important, we're just going to step back.
This is a very interesting analogy. I think it really helps to paint this picture, but bring people in to talk about these things that can be really troublesome for people. So Jeff, I want to move on to our last question here. So sure. You and I met this past summer at the Ford Museum. You were moderating an event called Restoring Trust and Rebuilding Institutions. So I had been driving around Grand Rapids, and I had seen that I saw a billboard that was promoting the Ford Museum. I think it was the heartbeat of a vice president. It was all about the new exhibit for President Ford. So I thought, man, I haven't been there in a long time. So I happened to be downtown, and it worked out. I ran in there, got a ticket, and I did like a real quick tour because I had an hour. It was right before closing time. And I was like, I think there's a lot to offer here, clearly, but even now. So I found out about your event, the Restoring Trust and Rebuilding Institutions. So that featured not only yourself and the Ford Museum, but also leadership from the Carter Center, formed and led by the former president, Jimmy Carter, who is 99 years old.
99.
That is amazing.
You could still run for president.
I guess he could. So I found the theme really intriguing. This idea of restoring trust and building institutions, because this has been, you know, a big rhetorical piece of the Republican Party, and specifically Donald Trump, through the Trump administration, and now as a candidate. Just this this idea that we cannot trust in the institutions, from the electoral processes to the Centers for Disease and Control and Prevention, all the way to the Department of Justice. There's this swirl of talk that we cannot trust these places. Why then do you do you think that, or how, I'll put it differently, why did the center, the Ford Center, put this on, wanting to use that language? Where did that come from?
We've been working with the Carter Center on quite a number of things, and we've got a very good relationship with them. President Carter and President Ford, after Carter lost the 1980 election, they developed a very close friendship. And so we thought, well, this is interesting. Here you have people who ran against each other in 1976. It was a heated campaign, as most campaigns are. Ford lost, and he conceded the election, but it was deeply painful to him to lose that election. He was certainly angry at Carter over a few things that happened during the election process. And then, but afterward, they thought, okay, so how can we work together, once political rivals? How can we work together for the public good? And so they both started presidential foundations right around the same time. The Carter Center kind of does their thing. We do our thing. The first thing that we've done with them is we've built relationships. There's a person at the Carter Center I've been working with on quite a few things. And I expect that if, she and I sat down and had a beer together and got into a lot of the fine grained stuff about politics, we'd find an awful lot that we disagree on, and some pretty fundamental things that we disagree on.
Yeah. And to be clear, former President Jimmy Carter was a Democrat.
He was a Democrat. Yep. So I'm sure we'd find things that we, as I said, fundamental things that really matter to us, that we disagree on. So what do? Well, you kind of bracket that and say, okay, we're not going to talk about that stuff that we really disagree on. We're going to focus on the stuff that we agree on, that we can actually accomplish, and only accomplish if we work on it together. But when all this other stuff is constantly intruding on our work with one another, we'll never get to the point where we can pursue the common good. Because the good is that good that we have in common, right? The word common does so much work there. Mm-hmm. What's a purely private good? What's a group good? What are the goods that are necessary for everyone, and that everyone has an interest in?
Yeah, and I think we'll close this conversation here, because after attending that event, then in September, so I signed up for the Ford Museums, the email. So I received this email saying, "Hey, we've put out this statement," and the statement was a joint statement from 13 presidential foundations and centers from across the United States, led by the George W. Bush Presidential Center, that said essentially, we want to strengthen our democracy. Here's what we think the current state of politics, and let's move together. Can you, before we cut out, can you just speak to that briefly? I know that you've done a few interviews on this, like with the Kansas Reflector. The New York Times has covered this, the Washington Post. Clearly, this is a big statement. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us about why this is such a big statement?
Well, it's a big statement, first of all, because presidential foundations, this is the first time that all 14 presidential foundations have gotten together and done something like this. Usually we're kind of off doing our own thing. Actually, the Eisenhower didn't sign it, so 13 out of the 14 signed it. And it's an indication of the depth of the problem and also the extent of the problem. that we're looking around and saying we're entering a very dangerous territory here. And I think the mutual interest we all have is in peace, right? We want to have a peaceful society and a peaceful way of resolving our differences with one another. And there are reasons to assume that people are increasingly resorting to violence as a way of resolving their political differences. And so that the greatest good of political life is peace. And that's something we all have an interest in. That's a common interest. So we thought that we had a kind of rhetorical position and sufficient public authority to get together and say something like that, and to remind Americans, that our constitutional system has done a pretty good job maintaining the peace for 236 years. Obviously, one problem in the middle there. And that B, we can't take such a thing for granted. And if we don't attend to this project, if we let it collapse, if we don't exercise authority properly, it can get ugly in a hurry, and that's what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah. Well, Jeff Polet, director of the Ford Leadership Forum at the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation, thank you for spending time with us this morning. This has been just really great, a great conversation to help us understand what's going on in politics and how to kind of distill things down and make it more palatable for folks and give them ways to engage. How can people get involved with your work? What should they do if they're interested?
If they're interested, they can go to our website, fordforum.org. And one of the things we do is we talk about the programs that the Leadership Forum is putting on. We also publish a lot of essays. So I have some essays on that presidential statement, the state of democracy, people might be interested in reading for a more comprehensive idea. And then the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation website also has information about programs that we have. And they can join and become members and always be invited to our events.
Great. Shawn, any parting words before we let Jeff go?
No, just thanks for joining us this morning. It's been enlightening. It's been a pleasure meeting you and having our conversation and everything.
Yeah, likewise. You guys are fun.
Well, thank you. We would love to have you back and have some more conversations. So you are welcome back.
All right, great. Sounds good.
All right, Jeff, you can leave this meeting. Shawn and I are going to stay on for a few minutes and wrap things up.
All right. Nice to meet you guys.
See you, Jeff. Nice to meet you.
Bye.
Shawn, how about maybe 3 minutes of a takeaway? What were your thoughts on talking with Jeff?
Well, it was interesting hearing him talk about the differences in politics. I wish I would have gotten a little deeper with him on when he was a professor teaching and how he would work with students, and I didn't think about it till like the very end, but I would like to have him back on so we could talk a little bit more specifically on when he was teaching and how he dealt with students that might be really affected one way or the other type thing, and trying to figure out their own identity. It's really neat to see so many different presidential foundations getting together to try to remedy some of what's going on in politics today. I think that's a good first step to start seeing, some like-minded communities that are not of the same thing trying to become part of the same thing for a common good type thing, opposed to always being separated.
Yeah, that's fascinating. When I heard about this statement, it really kind of blew my mind because, so the New York Times has written about it, the Washington Post and other various places have picked this up. But in reading it myself, it came as an idea from the George W. Bush Foundation, led by David Kramer. So there was the idea there, and then trickling out to these other centers. Now, 2 presidential centers did not sign on to this, but it was, And reading between the lines, one could say that it is a direct rebuke of the Trump administration and really pushing things towards, what happened on January 6th. Just the the violent storming of and into the Capitol. So I just was like, wow, this is a big thing coming from people in these leadership spaces. So that listener and Shawn, if you want to read on that further, it's called "Strengthening Our Democracy." President, is that the name? Strengthening Our Democracy. Yeah. All right. We need to get out of here. So, listener, thank you for your time this morning. Be sure to follow us on our Facebook page, Vote Common Good West Michigan Primary. That's where these episodes are dropping. We have one currently out, and we are planning to drop these on a bi-weekly basis. So, for the common good, for Common Good Conversations, my name is Nick Brock, and
I am Shawn Skinner.
we will see you next time. Thanks, friends.
See you guys. Thanks.